Well, he's back today for third round on the podcast, and I assume this is not the last time we see him. It's Eastern Roman history, Daniel Maynard, and welcome back.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
So this episode is little bit different because today is Drunk History Round 2. If you haven't followed the podcast since early times, you know that episode 14, I believe, would be for our first round where me and Eric Tiller, a good friend of mine, discuss history, and we will do the same in this time, just with different guests. And I don't know if you're drinking, but at least I am, so we're going to see how it goes under the influence, which is
yes, I have a glass of beer with me, so
always
I've come prepared.
Salud, my friend. So
Salud.
basically we will be discussing general history, mostly because his area is, of course, Latin, Roman, and Byzantine history. But I will try to do, in that general history, and we will see where it goes. And I don't think we discussed this before you were on. So how did you get into history yourself?
I think, just from an early age, I always enjoyed seeing castles and museums, and my family's always been interested in history, and it sort of runs in the family a little bit. There's a strong interest, and then a lot of my pastimes involve sort of things from the past. So I think there's always been a sort of an interest, and I like watching documentaries about things like ancient Egypt and English history and so on. And then at school, I always really enjoyed history, and I think, and as time has gone on, it's the thing I've devoted myself to doing. So,
yeah. So for me, I'm not studying history like you. I'm just learning from reading books, like probably you will write eventually. So, that's how I get my knowledge. I'm not a professional historian by trade, but for me, it's about learning. I've always been curious about how did we get the culture that we have today? Different civilizations. How did people react in the past times? How did empires collapse? How did the Romans become so big? And I'm this is the word I'm going to use a lot, fascinated by Roman history and, antiquity, and how did, all these empires become so powerful, and how did it last for centuries like they did? That's kind of, how did we end up where we are today? That's kind of my basic for how I got into history. So I think it's super interesting to learn how did we end up where we are,
Well, I think it's ironic in a way that for the Romans, when they first, for several centuries, they were little more than a petty kingdom in Italy. And then they went on to conquer the Mediterranean and become one of the most influential civilizations in, at the very least, European, if not world history. So some of these things are very humble beginnings.
Yeah.
And there is another world where maybe Persian society would have been the great power that everyone learns about and loves, but it was not to be. And
strange
reverses in history that sometimes arise.
Speaking of the Persians, I kind of did a joke about how the Battle of Marathon, how it wasn't about running. So I was finding out. So you don't think that it's one guy that shows up at the Battle of Marathon and believes? So aren't we supposed to? Why are you guys dressed up in armor? Why aren't you running? He said, "Sorry, jogging gears." Like, come on.
Well, the run is just about
marathon. It's not. It's a literal battle. It's in front. Why did you not get this on the flyer?
Quite. Well, that's the ironic thing, I think, that a battle from over 2 millennia ago is commemorated even today by people making the same run in distance as the person that was sent to Athens to say that they won the battle.
Yeah.
So it's baked into European and world thought in some ways, whether they realize the significance or not.
Speaking of battles, it's fascinating to me how weather has such a big saying in how a battle turned out. Like when Caesar tried to invade Britain, how the weather changed everything. How if it maybe wasn't misty, maybe Caesar would have been known to conquer Britain as well. Like he would probably conquer the continent if it wasn't for the battle, for example, or how Suleiman the Magnificent, because the weather and it was raining and the ground was so muddy. They couldn't bring the cannons that they were supposed to have at the siege of Vienna in this. I believe it was the 16th century. I don't have the date in my head, but how weather can determine everything in a battle like that is super fascinating to me.
Well, definitely the elements are a very significant thing, and also taking advantage of the weather can be very the Emperor John III, he did quite a lot of his campaigning during the winter because it was very unusual to launch winter campaigns because you're
talking Byzantine history?
Yes, this is 13th century. So John III won an important victory right at the beginning of his reign against the Latins in a revolt in his own domain against him. And he won because one of the reasons why he managed to win was his army managed to fall upon them with surprise because he marched his army in the winter against them and they weren't expecting that. So when he arrived, they were not prepared. So it's amazing how, well, maybe not amazing, but it's interesting how the elements can be used and have played a role in history. Yeah,
just think of how different history would be like if the weather wasn't like that on that day on that specific battle, or if when Caesar or Suleiman tried to invade Vienna or Caesar tried to invade Britain. That's super, again, fascinating to me how things turn out.
Oh, definitely, it's and also sometimes it's just it's simple things that can have major consequences. It's like I always like to think of Claudius behind the curtain that
as the sources say, at least
as the sources say, that the Praetorian Guard found him and proclaimed him emperor. And
I think, speaking of Claudius, I think he's one of the. I kind of have a love relationship for Claudius because I feel like he's one of the most underrated emperors, and I weep every time when I think about the lost Etruscan history that we have because it got lost when Claudius passed.
Well, I always think it's a great shame that we don't have anything don't have any of the histories that he wrote, because I'm sure they would have been quite interesting to read.
And he wasn't quite lucky in marriage either, though.
No, he was really terrible at choosing wives.
Agrippina was a piece of work, to put it that way.
Yes, and his former wife, Marcellina, you have the famous incident where she had a competition with Rome's leading prostitutes to try and sleep with as many men as possible while Claudius was out of the city. Which, I don't know, I feel...
You kind of feel sympathy for Claudius.
Some hubris to do that in the face of Claudius.
I feel kind of related. In a way, I kind of relate to Claudius, and he's kind of a relatable character in history, and you feel sympathy for him in a sense.
I feel like quite a lot of the popular. I think one of the reasons why we do think about Claudius as much as we do is because of the great success of the book and then later television series I,
Yeah.
Claudius by Robert Graves, which
That's a 2002 series, or
the series came out in the 1970s, which was a big success and was a star-studded cast with famous actors like
I think I've
Derek
seen a
Jacobi.
clip of that one.
Yeah, I think there are some about, but the series is great. It's just like you've got.
What did you think about the portrayal of the characters there? I think I've only seen clips of it, but what did you think about the portrayal?
I mean, it takes.
It's not the one where Germanicus is as well.
He does appear in it. I think. Well, I mean, it takes on a very traditional reading of Suetonius, really, and some other sources, and Robert Graves portrays events in a certain way. So Livia is responsible for massacring half of the imperial family, which is sort of you'd have to believe every rumor about a Roman emperor of the imperial family for that to happen. Because everyone says like, oh yes, Augustus, who was in his late 70s by that point, it's like, oh, he was dying and he wasn't very well. And then his wife decided to poison him for his son. And I feel like, well, not only could that be a rumor, and quite a lot of people in the first few emperors were rumored to have been murdered by various people.
What do you think about the portrayal of Claudius? Because I seen just a few clips of the series actually yesterday, as a matter of fact, because again I was actually finishing the book about Germanicus, and he mentioned this series in the show, and I found it on YouTube to see what it was like. I kind of thought it was kind of accurate the way they portrayed Claudius from the few clips I've seen of the series.
Yeah, well, Claudius, it does ignore some of Claudius's lesser qualities. So he was he really enjoyed circus games, and also he was responsible for trying people behind in sort of private courts, which was well, maybe, I suppose it depends on how you interpret it, but Suetonius does level several criticisms against Claudius, which are genuine criticisms and not.
I just want to add that I just seen a few clips, like 3-4 minutes clips of the series, but from what I saw, it's kind of seemed like the way he's described by sources that he seems fairly accurate, I think.
Yeah, or at least how Robert Graves saw it. And but I think also Derek Jacobi does an incredible job of portraying Claudius as outwardly, to all the people he knows, he's this dumb idiot that hobbles around and can't stop twitching, and then you've got
relatable
with a stutter, and then the sort of behind closed doors, he's this very intelligent, very savvy person that manages to survive all of them. In fact, one of my favorite moments from the series is when he meets the Senate for the first time, speaking as emperor, and they level a bunch of charges against them. And I think I remember the line. It's like, so a senator goes up to him and says, there are those that say you cannot hear properly, you cannot see properly, and you have no experience of government. And then Claudius replies, and besides, I am half-witted. Says, and his reply is great. It's like, it is true, I am hard of hearing, but it's not for want of listening. And it's like, for speaking, it is true I have an impediment. But isn't what a man says more important than how long he takes to say it?
Yeah, fair enough.
And then it's like, it is true I have no experience of government, but have you more? I, at least, have lived with the imperial family for however many years, and I've watched it working more closely than any of you. Does your experience measure up to that? And then for being half-witted, it's like, and for being half-witted.
Yeah, that's a real good punchline.
As all I can say is I have survived with half my wits, whereas thousands have died with all of theirs intact. Evidently, quality of wits is more important than quantity.
Right.
And it's just, yeah, that's a great scene.
I mean, considering, what did you think? Have you seen a series on HBO called Britannia?
I'm afraid not, no.
Because that's kind of like about the invasion. I've seen just season 1 and parts of season 2. And it's about the invasion of Britain by Rome. It's fictional, of course. It's like entirely fictional, and it has fictional gods. It's not, don't take that serious, but actually it's kind of fascinating because in the first episode, Claudius appears as a character there. So, since he wasn't the one that invaded Britannia, but it was, he did go there for some time, and it was when he came back to Rome.
He sent in Paulus? Can't remember the chapter.
I don't remember. I don't know.
He
I don't know who
sent
in
the main force, and then he followed up with some elephants in a secondary
force.
Yeah, that's
right. I thought this was actually decently portrayed in that one as well, because it's a quite grotesque series, because it focuses a lot on the tribes of UK at the time. It's like entirely fictional series. Like, don't take any of what happens in the series like literal. Like this totally happened. This 100% happened in that's how they did it.
Yeah.
But it's still interesting, and it's an enjoyable series. It has 2 seasons on HBO, and if you do have HBO, take the time to watch it, because I would recommend it. Actually, it's what's the actor's name who portrayed? He was in The Office. He played Garrett. Garrett is his name. Mackenzie something.
Ooh,
he portrays a druid in the series.
Right.
And it's quite good. I think it's more kind of like a Game of Thrones-ish series set in the Roman world, actually.
I think Game of Thrones has influenced many series that want to, and I wouldn't be surprised if the next couple of years we have a lot of series attempting to emulate it.
Yeah, you can definitely see the influence of Game of Thrones in the series. But speaking of fictionals, have you seen the show Barbarians on Netflix?
I did watch that, yes.
I actually loved it, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to read about your managers as well, because he's going to appear in season 2 of the series, obviously, because he came in as a general in real life, and he took induce as chair of the business.
Yes.
After various fall. What did you think about Barbarians?
I did enjoy the series on the whole. In fact, ironically, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest I thought was the most disappointing thing about the series. Which is a shame. And they also had this ridiculously long monologue going on throughout it, which sort of was just words being strung together for some of it. And if you haven't seen it, and
spoiler alert.
I don't know how many spoilers you can have for a history series.
Yeah,
but there's this monologue going on through it, and you have Arminius saying it.
Is that a scene when
it
he's
was
like
just
in the
sort
tent
of
and he's kind of reveals the plan how he
well,
when Sir Justice and Varys is kind of in the same scene and he's kind of like Sir Justice is he's trying to betray you and he tells exactly what's going to happen and that's what happens.
yeah, it was really long, and it was just after a bit, it was just sort of words being strung together and broke up the actual what was going on.
Fair enough.
In the battle as well, but yeah, but the rest of the series I thought was decent, and I did enjoy watching it. So,
I mean, what I do respect though is that they actually got the Romans speak Latin, which I honestly haven't seen before.
And they have the German speaking German,
yeah.
Which, yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's. I mean, I'm not one of these people that goes, "Oh, yes, every culture should be speaking exactly the language they were."
I mean, I do appreciate the fact that they do actually go the extra.
But yeah, I do think, yeah, if that's a creative choice, and yeah, more for them.
Speaking of again, do you have a favorite like fictional or not fictional but historical portrayal of any historical event? And if it isn't Braveheart, you're out of here. I'm sorry. No, but seriously, like, do you have a favorite portrayal of any historical event from movies,
I give Mel
series?
Gibson credit for making a perfect one-dimensional version of Edward I. Yes. If you ever wanted a pure villain cartoon character of Edward I, look no further than Braveheart, because you will not be disappointed. A man that is quite willing to shoot his own men with the added benefit of hitting the Scots. Yes. But anyway, so our favourite portrayal of a historical character. That was the question,
like series, TV show, movie, whatever.
I really like, if you've seen the series The Last Kingdom, I thought the guy playing Alfred the Great was really good. It was, I think you got across, I mean, I've read up about Alfred the Great, but I wouldn't say it wasn't my specialty.
Yeah.
But from what I do know of Alfred, and I've read a bit of Asser's life of Alfred, it's you've got this tough, very savvy Christian monarch who trying to make the best out of his circumstances, and a really great portrayal by the actor who I can't remember his name, unfortunately, off the top of my head, but he did a really good job. It's one of the, and his relationship with Uhtred is very good. I think also a good thing about The Last Kingdom, and also its sister series Sharp, which is based on the same books by Bernard Cornwell, is that it merges.
Is it mainly historical fiction, or is it like?
He merges true events with fiction. So the protagonist of Sharp, Richard Sharp, is a fictional character, but all of the situations he's in are true events. So there was a battle of Talavera, where the Duke of Wellington becomes the Duke of Wellington, and it's a major victory. And then he uses that scenario, and a lot of the people that end up being involved in there end up in the book. And then he usually has a historical note at the end of his books explaining what the history is, and then what he changed in the book to fit in his fictional character, Richard Sharp. And sometimes he takes over roles that real people had, or is alongside real people. And I think it's a great way of adding in enough fiction and drama to bring the event to life, but also a great way of grounding that in a historical context and the people from that event. So you get people like the Duke of Wellington, and people going down the line, officers, the men on the ground, and so on.
I don't say, for me, I don't say Barbarians is definitely in top 5, and not I've seen too much historical or dramatizations, but Barbarians mostly because I do praise the fact that the actors learn Latin. I don't know if they learn it, but like they speak Latin quite well, I think. I don't speak Latin myself, and I can't say anything professional on the case, but I think that Barbarians is one of those series that deserves high praise. I'm trying to at least be, I think, historical correct as it can get, I suppose. And I'm curious to see how they portray season 2 with Germanicus arriving on the scene and how they portray the battles with Germanicus, because they eventually, capture Tusnelda, and they do get her, and the Romans manage to capture her and set justice into Roman territory, which is and I'm looking forward to see how does season 2 play out. Another series that comes to mind is I just had it. I can't believe I just stopped that brain freeze here. But I'm gonna go on. Right. I'm gonna go on a limb. This is 100% satire. It's a comedy and it's satire. So don't take this as historical correct. Mm-hmm. And but it's Norseman. It's a Norwegian series that was filmed.
Right.
And it's not necessarily because I'm trying to be 100% historical correct and everything, but
of course.
The thing is that ironically they are more historically correct than Vikings, the famous HBO series. But it's satire on both modern day and the Viking age.
Yeah.
On how Vikings behaved.
If you want to take the piss out of something, you have to know what you're making fun of.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a comedy, and it's just kind of the thing is that the film, it's on Netflix. They filmed twice actually. They filmed both in Norwegian originally because it was filmed for the local television channel, and Netflix got interested in the series, and they asked if they can film in English as well.
Right.
So they film, and the accent and everything they do is kind of on purpose. So that's kind of one of my favorite historical TV shows, I think. And on third, I would say The Great which is set in Russia. Again, satire, but again, it's got me interested in Russian history. So it's going to be up there. It's going to be up there.
Let's see.
But I'm genuinely, I want to know: do you, as a historian yourself, do you read other people's work, or do you just concentrate on primary sources, or do you mainly focus on secondary sources? Primary first. Do you mainly focus on primary sources or mainly secondary sources?
Well, typically, it depends. Well, first, it depends on your approach. Are you visiting a historiographical problem which you think needs to be revised, or are you looking at something which is derived from the primary sources? In both cases, you'll end up using both, because the secondary sources are based, or the scholarship is based on primary sources, of course. So, and if you're revising scholarship, then you need to go back to the sources they've based their assertions on, and maybe even bring in new evidence, which
How
hasn't
often
been
do you have to
considered.
like dismiss that something is this is definitely over exaggerated, or this probably did happen in another way that is described?
Uh, in terms when you come up against a primary source.
Yeah.
Um, it depends on. I think that there are two major factors. I think is so. What is it that you're reading? Are you reading something which is trying to be as level-headed as possible? True, they may get things wrong, but trying their very best to try and tell you the truth, and also who the person that is writing it says. So, like, who is writing this? Is this a grateful son talking about their father or daughter, or is this someone writing sort of fairly absent from their times and not trying to write in an objective way? So, what's the provenance of the source you're reading? And also cross-referencing things. So what does, if you can, what does one person say and what does another person say? And if they say two different things, why are they saying two different things? Is it because they've based their information on two different sources? Is it because they one is trying to obscure the facts and one isn't? I came across a quite good example in my own experience where looking at the grandfather and father of the Emperor Nicephorus III, the guy I came
Actually,
on
we made an episode a
last
while
time to
back in
talk about.
October.
Yes, which I should be releasing something on my channel for him soon.
If you want to check it out, we made, I believe, episode 50 something, like in October, which is 1.5 hours. So if you want to know about Nicephorus III, go check it out.
If you want to hear me blithering on about emperor who reigned for 3 years, then you know where to go. But yes, so there are two sources that give you some weighty information about his grandfather and father. The first one is Michael Italiates, and he says that his grandfather is called Nicephorus Botaniates. He's killed at the Battle of Claudius after being thrown from his horse. And then there's another source, John Skylitzes, who's writing under the reign of Alexius Comnenus, and he says his grandfather was Theophylact Botaniates, so it's called something different. He was killed after the Battle of Claudius in 1014, and he was killed in an ambush. And so some of the details are the same. So he did have a grandfather who was in this campaign. He was killed in the same year, but the specific details are completely different, to the point where Italiates has even changed his name. And the only reason why he would do that is because he is writing for the Emperor Nicephorus. And so why would he change it? Of course, Nicephorus wants to portray his ancestors as something different. He's a man that needs to establish his legitimacy. And one of his big things is that he's this very experienced soldier and governor. And then if you have people looking back at his ancestors and finding out that his grandfather was killed in an ambush by some Bulgars, whereas you have his heroic grandfather killed in the major battle of their times by unfortunately being thrown from his horse.
Right, you're gonna go.
It gives two different messages. One is definitely trying to big up Nicephorus's ancestry and sort of smooth over the things he'd rather other people didn't know. And then John Skylitzes, who is using who summarize quite a lot of his older histories, is probably just reading straight from a history at the time what happened. And there is no, I need to change the events to make things more than there are, because Nicephorus is long dead by that point.
Yeah,
So.
Tacitus is a good example of that, I think, because he writes several years after something happened, right? He writes Tacitus, like, well, again, I want to use Germanicus as an example here. If he writes about Germanicus, he's been dead for several years, maybe a few hundred years. I don't remember, don't have the days in my head right now, but like Tacitus writes.
I think Tacitus is writing about 40, 50 years later. He's sort of writing at the end of the first century.
Few decades later. So for him, he has to draw on other primary sources to find out what happened. It wasn't murdered by Tiberius, who should portray as the villain in the story. So it's kind of similar, right? Tacitus is I think he's a good example of this.
Yeah, I think that's also why he adds in rumors and things like that. So, like, it was rumored that this happened, because...
Do you think it makes it difficult for historians such as yourself when people who write 50, 30 years after, again, throws out their third primary source, not as primary source, but third source, if you will.
When they're not even sort of near the events that they're talking about. They're an authority basing their work on sources who weren't even there also, and so on.
Like Dio, for example, who writes about
Cassius
events.
Dio. Yeah, he's early 3rd century, writing the entire history of Rome in 80 books. And he's writing from a very... he's definitely a secondary source on a lot of matters. But as you get further towards his time, the author, starts to enter into the account much more. And in fact, you get anecdotes of when the Emperor Commodus did this to Mr. Cassius Dio. Which is always quite fun.
It's the same with Herodotus, isn't it? Like, he wrote accounts from people, I think, a generation after the Battle of Marathon, he wasn't present himself.
He's writing after the first. It's after Xerxes' invasion, so it's after the end of the Persian invasions, in the 4th century BC, and 4th century? No. 5th century. So I'm used to AD. 5th century?
We're talking BC here, by the way. Just
Hold on. 5th century BC, so 400s BC. And he's talking...
He just... isn't he, like, basing his fact on a generation after?
He begins with histories by saying he's inquiring into why the Persian War happened. So that's his inquiry. And then he sort of goes into all sorts of histories and stories that he's collected on his travels. Because he's having to collect sources from all sorts of different mediums, sort of inscriptions, oral histories, tablets. And I mean, Herodotus does get flack for being just sort of believing everything he's being told, or just not being as objective as he could be.
Right now. Yeah, we're talking about Herodotus. Hello? Hello? Are you there? Okay. Pause a little bit and wait until we get back. I'm sorry about that. We just had to get a little break. And I'm going to wait until we get back. And we see what happens. Well, Yeah, sorry about that. We had just such a little break in the recording, and we were talking about Herodotus. So
Mm.
back to Herodotus.
Yes. Oh, yes. I was saying that lots of people sort of give him flack for not being as historically rigorous
Mm.
as perhaps people want him to be. But in his defense, I would say that he has no standard to work off of. So it is just sort of a see what happens. And also, the sources he's working with are very difficult as well, in that they're all sorts of different mediums. They're coming from different traditions and all histories and so on, which are not necessarily reliable. And if they are, then you could perhaps talk to two different people saying the same story, and it'll be different details and so on. So I think some credit should be given, or more credit should be given to Herodotus for actually being able to make a historical account of all of these different civilizations, because he talks about Egypt and Greece and Persia and Lydia as well. So, and then sort of the next generation of authors like Thucydides and then Xenophon and Theopompus and so on refined the sort of art of history making. But yes, Herodotus was a great pioneer of history.
It's difficult when you find two sources, two primary sources that you kind of contradict each other. That this happened, no, this happened actually, and it's difficult to determine that. No, I think actually this happened.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just because, especially if they're writing a lot later, it's because they've used different sources of information. It's like I found a very good example of this, which was very intriguing. And so there are two major Byzantine sources for the first Arab siege of Constantinople in the 7th century, and one of them mentions Greek fire being used, and the other doesn't. So the one that does is Theophanes, and the one that doesn't is Nicephorus the Patriarch, and they're writing in the late 8th, early 9th century. And so why are they different is because both of them are using two different sources of information. One of them is just using an older Byzantine source, which we don't have, but we can, because of the similarities between the two sources, roughly reconstruct from similarities between them what this earlier history looked like. And then the unique information in Theophanes must come from another source, which has been identified as Theophilus of Edessa, who was a Christian Syrian Christian from the 7th century, who wrote a list of animals. So in this year, this happened. And Theophanes' account is made from those two sources, roughly. Whereas Nicephorus only has the one. So you have two accounts saying two different things.
Yeah.
And then, so they're having to interpret events from the sources they're using in the 8th and 9th centuries. And then we're having to interpret what their histories say in the 21st century. So there's lots of layers to history, like onions.
Yeah.
And sometimes finding new interpretations and revising our understanding of events is about looking deeply at the sources and then working out what they're saying. It's like later traditions. Why are they saying this? What is their information based on? And then you can maybe go back up the tree and find out that actually all 5 of these sources are just basing their knowledge on this one source from much earlier, and then you have to question whether that source is correct, and then and sometimes you find that original source has been so overly interpreted that the over-interpretations are sort of treated as the verbatim, this happened, where actually these are inferences based on sort of obscurities and innuendos. And it's like, how reliably should we take this particular narrative? Yeah. I mean, I think there's a great example about the Battle of Milvian Bridge, where Alan Cameron, who was a very eminent scholar, picked apart the battle, and there's several versions of what happened.
And the middle, of course, for those who may not know, the Milvian Bridge is, of course, the battle with Constantine.
Oh, that's another one.
Arguably, was it that battle you were referring to?
The Frigidas is.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. Sorry, I heard wrong. Yeah,
but the Milvian Bridge is a very good example of sort of.
I heard wrong. That's fine.
Oh no, that's no problem. But I think the same principle applies, that you have lots of different people saying different things about the same event based on different sources.
Yeah.
So Eusebius, he has an account of the battle, and one of his sources is Constantine himself, but he's writing much later. And in fact, his history of that same event is slightly different in his life of Constantine, which is written even later than his ecclesiastical history. They have two versions from the same person, which is quite amusing. So you can see how Constantine's propaganda about the event developed. Then you have a much earlier source in Lactantius, but actually one of the most contemporary sources for the Battle of Milvian Bridge, apart from the actual arch of Constantine itself, which was made soon after, and actually depicts the Milvian Bridge and people being driven into it, is actually a panegyric made a few months later in the following year. And this would have been someone who was asked or wrote a speech to be spoken aloud to Constantine. And he talks about the Milvian Bridge and what happened. And there's a lot of features about it that are present in that speech that are also present in other things like Lactantius and Eusebius. But his version of events is different still. So sort of Maxentius rushes out to meet the Constantine in battle, and Constantine has a big religious epiphany during the campaign, and there's so these elements about the battle, and then afterwards it's like, yes, the god I championed helped me win. So it's like this common elements, but then the details keep changing from source to source. So
yeah, something I want to talk about as well when we talk about primary sources right now, and because I read Gallic War, unfortunately I don't speak Latin like at all, but I read the Gallic War in the translated English version, of course, and it's a great read, and I would recommend anyone to read it. But what should someone who's not a historian like me, and you want to read a primary source, because I'm going to read very soon, which I'm really excited about, to read Anacomnianus Alexiad, for example. To picture an example of this, what would you say we should expect going into reading a primary source for someone who has to read a translated version because we don't know the original language that it was written in? What would you say? Would you give any advice to someone like us who has to read translated version because we don't know Latin, Greek, or whatever language we want to read the primary source in?
Well, I think I think a great benefit of a translation is that, okay, you're not reading it in the original language, but you're getting something very close to. I mean, so long as the translation is good, which
I mean, not only talking about translation that that it may not be the original words that Anna Komnene or Caesar wrote, but like, what should we think about concerning biasry, or if it's biased source? What should we know going into reading a primary source, if you know what I mean?
I think it's important to, and often text and translations have introductions which help set the scene in some way. So who wrote it, what audience they're writing for, which I think is a good thing to note when you're going into a primary source. Like Caesar, he's
his bias.
He portrays himself. Yeah, it's like he's portraying himself as being objective as possible to give himself historical authority, but he's publicizing his campaigns.
Why did he write himself in third person? Why did he write the way he do? And you should look that up before going into, so you know what to expect when you're going to reading the Gallic War for the first time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, of course, you can just read it and for its own enjoyment, which I think is definitely a worthwhile thing in doing, because not only would these things have been read aloud, but especially among high society, you would have people passing around histories and so on. It's like, oh yes, please send me your copy of the Alexiad because I want to read it. And I think both audiences from then and now can enjoy the literature from those ages just as much as something like Chaucer or something, but or Shakespeare. But I think it's like, who are they writing for? It's like Caesar, his works would have been read out in the middle of Rome with lots of crowds. So
Caesar's Gallic War was written obviously for his own political agenda. Like, I'm not the villain in the story. I'm doing this for the empire, for Rome. I'm doing this because to get political support. I mean, he sent the letters back to Rome. We know that's why he wrote it. But like, generally,
and I think there's a big reason why we know so much about Caesar and his wars in Gaul, Germany, and Britain. And then we go, now tell me about Pompey's wars in the East. I feel like it doesn't quite have the same ring to it in some ways. I
mean, you know that Pompey...
But that's partially because Pompey didn't bother to write these things down for us, and also have capture the popular imagination that Caesar's Gallic and then his civil wars did.
It was propaganda that he wrote it for. I mean, for someone who is a history buff like me, like he wrote it because he wanted to support the Senate, etc., etc.
I think,
but for someone that might get into this for the first time, it might be, it's different. I don't know. It might be difficult for someone who reads, who it's not really want to read the Gallic War, who isn't really that much into history for the first time.
I feel like if you're picking up Caesar's Gallic Wars, you must have some interest in history.
You should.
Just as much as if you're picking up the latest book on astronomy or something.
Yeah.
You must have some interest in that field.
Fair enough, yeah.
Or even fiction. It's like, if you're someone who's very much into horror stories, and someone gives you, you can expect that person to buy a horror book, for instance.
Yeah.
But I think so. Something like the Alexiad, I think, is important if you want to try and catch out the author and sort of look a bit deeper. Is when you're reading, not just sort of think about what they're saying, because a lot of these people do actually write some semblance of the truth, but they like to obscure the things that they don't want to talk about.
Yeah.
But they have to talk about it because otherwise everyone would call them a liar.
Yeah, what fascinated me about the reading the Dalek War for the first time was that Caesar actually acknowledged that he had defeats when the sense of, and I don't remember specifics in the head because I'm not a historian like you are, but like how he actually acknowledged that his armies did in fact have defeats and they did suffer tremendous loss sometimes. That he did write that down. He did actually notice that this did happen. He wasn't always victorious.
Yeah, is to give yourself credibility, and sort of affirm your status as an objective author as much as you can be. Because also it depends the style of history you're going for. So like if you're reading a classicizing history like Anna Komnene wrote, there are certain rubrics that you need to write about. You start off with your assertion of, I shall tell the truth, or as much as I am able to. And then sort of you focus on your political and military events and the big things that happen. And then it will sound very different when you read something like a chronicle or something like that, which is far more like if you were to read Theophanes, it's just sort of date, list of emperors and patriarchs, years of rule, and then in this year this happened. Also in this year this happened. So it's a very different sort of genre of literature. But something, I think a great thing for like can you spot the biases of Anna Komnene is as you're reading it, it's like, because she does mention things that she's definitely trying to avoid and sort of obscure, and it can be a good way of sort of improving your ability not to just take things at face value, but think more objectively about things. And especially, can you identify when she is trying to obscure something? Yeah. So like right at the beginning in the preface, she says something like, it's like the history I'm writing is something which not many people will like to hear, but as sort of, I have to write it because it's the truth. And then you go, but why would people object to this version of Alexius Comnenus? And then you look at the other contemporary history of Alexios's reign by John Zanaris, and there's a lot of criticism in that which Anna's either left out or changed to make Alexios in a better light, and John covers a lot of the same events in far less detail, but they're more not necessarily objective, but fairer in some ways. Yeah. He's less the Alexios, the definitely Homeric parallel. And then for John, he is just Alexios, the man who is the emperor. There is a difference, though, between when he is a father and you are just a historian that writes about him. I think that's one of the great things about the Alexiad as well, in that quite a lot of the emotion that Anna had goes into it. So like whenever she talks about her husband, who's dead by that point when she wrote, or Alexios, or her mother, or George Paleologus, who she would have known quite well and was a friend of hers, friend of her father's, you can almost feel you can almost conjure up in her mind her sort of being forcing back her tears as she writes this bit about her husband who's now dead, and it's like, I can only go on because the history demands it. But yeah, it's just, there's I think you can get a lot out of the Alexiad, as I said before, just as something to be read, as well as a source of historical information.
You shouldn't necessarily take it as 100% this happened when you read into it.
It's like there's a good comparison where Alexios, when he seizes Constantinople from Nicephorus III, and then he loses control of his army, Anna's like, his army dispersed into the houses of the people of Constantinople and started looting and stealing things, and started raping people and despoiling altars and churches. Well, they didn't kill anyone. And then John Zanaris, in his bit, says, well, they did all of this, and they started hauling senators off their horses and beating them to a pulp. And the streets are running with blood. And it's just like, I feel like someone is not telling the truth here.
Yeah.
So,
and I do definitely, with today's age, and if you're reading a primary source, I would definitely before you go into the subject source, because that's what I did, I would use YouTube, Google, just see what you can find. How much should you expect to be truth? What is biased? When you read a primary source, Google what you can find about the book before you go in. What the scholar says. What the scholars say about this book. For example, the Alexiad. What should you expect to be, or the Gallic work? What should you expect to be the truth? What should you expect to be, biased? What should you expect? Should you think this actually happened? If you're not a scholar, or if you do not study history, I would recommend you Google or use the value of the internet as a source for finding out at least some information about the book before you go into the primary source. If you're not a historian, I think
and most primary sources have very good introductions and commentaries in them as well. So there's definitely a resource to be used when you read something like that. And also, I think it's always a good idea to read not necessarily everything about a subject, but like if you're reading about Rome, find a book that covers, say, the late Roman Republic, and then sort of you can go from there and dive into it deeper. Like maybe you'd like to read some of Cicero's letters or Appian's civil wars or something like that. So have a bit more. Because that's the thing, you can read the primary sources, but also scholars have ideas, or maybe have read something that you haven't, that can bring in more to the historical debate.
So would you agree that you should, before going, if you're not a scholar, that you should research a little bit about the primary source before going into the primary source?
Well, as I say, it depends what you're reading it for, I suppose. If you're just reading it because you want to read it, then sure, then go ahead. If you're reading it because you want to get perhaps a better understanding of the historical period you're interested in, then it may be worth doing more research. But I feel like that comes naturally. So if you're very interested in, I don't know, the Emperor Claudius, I feel, at least in my experience, I naturally go, "Ooh, what were some of the finer details about Claudius's invasion of Britain, and why did he bring those elephants with him, and stuff like that?"
Yeah, I 100% agree. And But it's a good point to make. And
But if you just want to read Tacitus because it's Tacitus, then go ahead.
I want to end before we leave, and I want to ask: do you have any favorite alternative history that you know? There's a few YouTube channels out there, as you know, that covers alternative history.
Oh yeah.
But do you have any favorite yourself that you think could have happened that didn't happen eventually? That you think could have been the butterfly effect, to put it that way.
Yeah. I can't say anything specifically. I do remember at school we were looking at the history of Russia, and in one of our classes we were asked, think about a event you've learned about this term and ask a what if question. The what if question we asked was what happened if the Tsar Alexander II hadn't been assassinated. And I think the consensus I had then, which I still hold now, is that what if history, I think, is very useful for understanding the significance of an event. So, like
we discussed earlier, the weather could have changed everything in the battle.
So, like, what if Caesar hadn't had a storm when he crossed the Channel?
Yeah.
Maybe his campaign in Britain would have been could have had greater success, or maybe Roman armies would have had, or rulers would have had greater interest in going to Britain, because Caesar would have made the first impression for a lot of these people in that war. Why would I go to Britain? It's so stormy.
Yeah. For what they didn't know is that for the Brits, it was just another average day.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, I think what if history is very useful for considering the significance of events. I do think that when I have seen some videos where it's just like, well, if Caesar hadn't coughed on the 1st of January, 44 BC, then Claudius would never have invaded Britain. The Industrial Revolution would have never happened, and the entire space program would have been run by the Zulus.
Yeah.
And it's just like,
that wouldn't happen.
How do you know? It's just like the cause and effect.
What
many of
did it
these
take?
events are so drastic.
Yeah.
Or just there's so many ripples that you can have. That
Absolutely.
I would say that can you even be sure? Say the Industrial Revolution. Could you even be sure that that would happen in the same way that it did?
Yeah.
And I say that not to be sort of contrarian, but just to be as sort of be as honest as possible. It's like, could you genuinely say that had Caesar not been assassinated, would, I don't know, the Industrial Revolution not have happened for some reason?
And I was watching a video recently on the Ottoman Empire. What if the Ottoman Empire had invaded the South Americas or Americas?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say the video's name. I don't want to go again. I enjoy the channel, and I got all the respect for the channel, but so I'm not going to say the name. I don't want to sound like I'm bashing the channel or anything. But you know, I actually read God's Shadow, not God of War. Sorry, that's a video game. But God's Shadow by Alan McHale, who was a previous guest on the podcast, and I highly recommend you should check it out. But Salim the Dream had a plan to invade Morocco, and that would have allowed him eventually to conquer the Americas, because if he had,
that would be my answer.
because according to Alan McHale, he if he did conquer Americas, he would have had the access to the Atlantic shore, because that was that the Ottomans lacked access to the Atlantic shore. They would have sailed around the African continent in order to get to America in the first place, as you know. So the invasion plan never happened. I don't exactly remember why, and I'm a little drunk right now. That's maybe a reason why I don't remember why. But it's been a while since I read the book as well. It was in October, but so if Salim the Dream had in fact invaded Morocco, but this channel proclaims that if Salim the Dream if the Ottomans would have invaded America, then Minnesota.
And my response would be, would they?
Exactly.
How do you know?
Yeah, but in general, they would have to get access to the Atlantic, and they claim that the Spanish would never have to exist. And I disagree, because if Salim had in fact invaded Morocco, he should have had access to Atlantic Sea, and he should have, if he wanted to, get a piece of the American continent. But another fact that I kind of find, and this is one of the jokes that I've been working on, is that, and I'm going to go a bit further in time here, World War II.
Okay.
Which, Adolf Hitler is one of the most feared men at the time. Did you know that he should have had a very different name? History could have been very different if things had gone a little bit different before he was born, because his father was born illegitimate. I don't remember the name of his father or his grandfather right now, but his father was born illegitimate because his grandfather had an affair, I think, and I don't know if I remember. He had an affair with a maid or something. I don't remember the exact story. Mm-hmm. And Adolf Hitler's father was born, and he was punished severely. That's a simple history reference, by the way. Mm-hmm. But here, Adolf's father, I think, was born illegitimate. And I think, if I remember history correctly, someone in the comment might correct me if you care to comment, was that he was in Germany. If you were born illegitimate, you were born Schützengruber. I don't know if I said that name correctly. Schützengruber or something.
I see.
So imagine the most fair man in history if his grandfather had not made his child illegitimate by marrying his maid. The most fair man in history would have been called Schützengruber. What's Adolf Schützengruber up to? Oh, he's about to invade Lithuania again. Oh, that's Schützengruber. How is Schützengruber? It wouldn't have the same ring to it.
No, I think
so. It's funny how things turn out that it's Adolf Hitler, which eventually he will become known as, could have been called Schützengruber.
Indeed.
It just wouldn't have the same ring to it, He just wouldn't have been able to market himself as well, I think.
Well, I suppose you have ways of getting around it.
Yeah, fair enough. But it's kind of funny to think that he could have had a very, very different name. As if he didn't, if things had gone a little bit differently. So
interesting to see what happens when someone makes that what-if scenario.
Yeah. Adolf Schützengruber. If any Germans listen to the podcast, let me know if I spell that correctly. I genuinely don't know. if I said that correctly. My German is nicht sehr gut. So I think, if you're don't have anything more you want to say, I generally don't know because I'm a little bit drunk. I'm very lying if I wasn't under the influence right now. So which is the part, which is what this episode is about. To be fair,
But not too much.
nothing much, But I live on Porto.
Well, well, I don't know.
Do you have any other alternative history you would like to see, perhaps?
I think one of the troubles I find with delving too much into the what ifs of history is that, well, the big trouble is none of it happened.
Yeah.
So you are dealing with fantasy in a way.
Yeah, fair enough.
And as I say, there is merit to thinking about what if X happened in Y event.
It's just these little details that we discussed.
And I think I do know that some authors have made what if scenarios and then set a fictional setting in that scenario. So like, was it The Man in the High Castle? I haven't seen the series, but that is
I enjoyed The Man in the High Castle.
Alternate reality and where things were different. I think it can be quite fun in that regard because then you go, it's
there is actually, speaking of the Ottomans again, there is I haven't read it, but there is an Ottomans, I don't know if it's a short story or if it's just like a normal novel, but what if the Ottomans had invaded Paris? Would be fun. Which is a book out there.
Goodness. I don't know. But I think that that is a good context for exploration fiction. But I think that when you go sort of, well, this didn't happen, and then this would have caused this not to happen, and then you treat it as sort of, it's all exactly the same, but also you've changed things as well, and then you get into you've almost made a new history book by the time it ends, and it's just sort of, but none of this actually happened. So so what? But yes. I do like to ask what if, but my interest definitely lies in the history and not an alternate version.
Absolutely. And I like
the history
to say,
itself is often so interesting anyway.
Absolutely.
And sort of, there's always more things to explore, sort of like the economic history of things, social developments, cultural output, and the actual literature you can read. So like there are things from ancient Egypt from over 4,000 years ago, which we can still read because they've survived. And you go, this was something that people back then would have been able to enjoy, hopefully. And it's something that we can also experience now. And so you can, I think that's something very significant. And then sort of you have your more traditional fields of like military events, which I have a joke in Byzantine sphere because it's the one topic no one talks about. Well, that is changing more recently. There has been a revival in interest in Byzantine military history. But yes, for a very long time, it was just a subject no one did because it was not the in thing in the academy at the time. And then also political history, which the narrative of events, what happened, which is both fundamental and also I think is very interesting because as you analyze the sources, and think about what those sources are based on, how maybe has something been overinterpreted, or have we missed something, and then that can affect how you shape the narrative. So, it's like a fairly recent book about Byzantium in the mid 10th to 11th century. Brought in a lot of new research and sort of a lot of old theories about the period to do with feudalization and the wealthy landowners versus the emperor, was constructed on very thin evidence and sort of over interpretation.
He was dismissed in a way.
The sources. It's like more recent scholarship has just gone, no, this is nonsense.
Yeah,
and actually, it does make sense in the context of the 20th century when a lot of these theories were being written under lots of, especially in Eastern countries like George Ostrogorski, who's a very eminent scholar for his day, and still one of the big names of the field, was undoubtedly influenced by the fact that he was writing under the communist Yugoslav regime, which, no matter how neutral he could be, he always had to write to their tastes in a way.
Yeah.
And other scholars that go, well, actually, the evidence that this is based on doesn't mention half of this stuff. And there's very simple explanations for why these things happen without sort of a grand theory of the aristocracy, of bigwig landowners oppressing the poor working class in Byzantium, which very strangely sounds like some other set of ideals. And then you go, well, it's because it didn't. And the evidence for it doesn't really suggest any of this.
Yeah.
It's been interpreted that way. And then when you look at it, re-examine the evidence and reinterpret it, that changes the narrative, of course. Which is why I feel like political history, although it does, for some scholars, it gets written off sometimes as just being unimportant. Who cares about events? By looking at the sources, the events change, of course. Because if something turns out to be complete nonsense, then that's a whole chapter in the standard history that needs to be rewritten.
Right.
So, but yeah.
Thank you so much for coming back. I don't think we have anything more to discuss at the moment right now.
Yeah, I think now is a good time to wrap things up.
Yeah, exactly. And you're always welcome back, of course, to the podcast should you have more
Thank you very much.
You wish to express or say.
Not too much at the moment. I hope everyone has a happy new year, since this is January, and
generally, I think being too late to say Happy New Year is by 1 or 2 weeks into New Year, January. Like that's too late to say Happy New Year 2 or 3 weeks into the New Year.
Well, Happy New Year anyway.
Yeah, pretty much. Happy New Year, and next week, Lindsay Powell will be on, and as we talked about in the early of the episode, we will be talking about Germanicus and his life as a general and orator, and much more. We will be talking about him in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Please consider rating us on iTunes. I assume that you have something you wish to promote, like your YouTube channel, etc.
Yes, if you're a fan of late Roman and Byzantine history and would like to delve a bit deeper into the subject, then check out Eastern Roman History, my YouTube channel, because there's all sorts on there, and I'm sure there's something you'll like.
Please consider rating us 5 stars on Spotify, on Apple Podcast. If you like this episode and if you like the podcast, we need your rating. Thank you very much. And if you don't like it, rate it 1 star. It's I'm not stopping you here. It's just rate whatever you feel like. Rate you can do it. Whatever you want. And we are on Instagram under Rod.H12. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts, basically. And as I said, next week we will be joined by Lindsay Powell and talk about Germanicus. This has been Drug History. I am a little bit drunk right now, I'm not gonna lie. And please like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.